Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Camfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. David Roediger is a socialist historian, probably best known for his 1991 book, The Wages of Whiteness, Race and the Making of the American Working Class. But he's written a lot since then, not least of which is probably my favorite of his books, Seizing Freedom, Slave Emancipation and Liberty for All, which came out in 2014. Earlier this year, I read his new memoir, An Ordinary White, My Antiracist Education, and it made me think it was high time to invite Dave to Victor's Children to talk about some of the people he's learned from over the years and aspects of anti-racist politics. So welcome to Victor's Children, Dave.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So the preface to your memoir, An Ordinary White, opens with an anecdote about some teaching about race and class that you did in the early 1990s, not in university classroom teaching, but teaching in summer schools for union members. So could you tell listeners about that experience and what you learned from it and the major point that you draw out from it?
Yes, I relate that story right at the first words of the book, or that story, because it sets up a lot of things that the book is trying to do. The circumstance was that I was teaching at University of Missouri, so I was in the St. Louis area, and I began to do in the early 90s a lot of teaching at union summer schools, socialist schools in some cases, and particularly with the automobile workers and the steelworkers unions. One steelworkers class I had the incoming international president was a student in my little class in Missouri. But I didn't really know how to do this. It was, before DEI and before all these trainings. And it was a time when actually the trainings were kind of good. They were done by movement people and nobody got paid and it wasn't an industry at all. So, but I didn't really know how to proceed. So I was teaching my very first class with the automobile workers, the region that Jerry Tucker, the insurgent leader of the UAW, had gotten elected to preside over. And they were doing some really interesting education. And they asked me to talk about race and already by that time to talk about whiteness. So as I went to the meeting, I agonized over the question I wanted to ask was, why would anybody want to be a white worker? Why not just a worker? But I kind of hesitated to ask it because I thought early 90s that some people would say, the audience was like 60 people, 70% white, that some people would say, oh, affirmative action forces me to think in terms of race, or the government forces me or the liberals force me to think in terms of race. And I didn't want that. And I also didn't want to ask a question that kind of led the white workers to sit back and be passive. And I'd seen this happen a lot of times in university classrooms where you ask a question about race and if there are some black students, everybody just sits and waits for the black students to talk. So I wrote the little question down on a piece of slip of paper, put it in my pocket. I said, I'll decide when I get there. I'll know what to do when I get there. Well, it turned out I grew up in the St. Louis area in Southern Illinois. It turned out that the workers there were so familiar to me, like me. I was 40. They were about 30s and 40s, most of them, and they came from St. Louis and from the little towns, little often sundown whites only towns that like the one that I grew up in. And I thought, I need to ask this question. I need to trust that it won't be a debacle to ask the question. And I know that these are interesting people. I know they're not without racism because I grew up in the same terrible structures that they grew up in. But I still wanted to hear. And so I asked, why would anybody want to be a white worker? And exactly what I hoped would happen, or didn't even dream would happen, happened. A lot of hands went up. They're almost all white workers. And they said really smart things about what the reasons to claim that identity are. They said you can get better home loans, better rates on home loans. They said you can buy a house in any neighborhood. They said the neighborhoods that open up to you have better schools for your kids. They said the cops don't get after you as much. And within the structure of the industry and the union, they said you have a much better chance to get into the skilled trades and make a lot more money. At that time, the union was integrated. The skilled trades were still largely segregated in the UAW. So these white workers, and I kind of intuited this, knew what their advantages were. And I opened the book with this because it's right around the time that critical race theory is being invented, the controversial body of knowledge of critical race theory. And it's really what critical race theory tried to do, was to say, what are these persisting white advantages that grow out of a history but continue into the present? And so these workers who, had very uneven consciousness, a little bit self-selected if you're going to summer school as a trade unionist, but they still were able to answer that question. And then we could have a really great across the board discussion in which Black workers and white workers both participated. I use it at the beginning of the book because a part of the point of the book is that I want to think about myself as not different, not utterly different from the workers that I grew up with, and to think of them as the great historian Howard Zinn used the word fathomable to describe what he thought that what attitude we had to have to cultivate a relationship with workers who may be conservative, who may be from small towns. That, if we start by thinking those workers are deplorable or they're incorrigible or whatever the Democrats call them when they're exasperated, we can't get very far into even hearing what they have to say. So this story for me kind of captures that there doesn't have to be this distance, and that academic workers don't have to say, I want to define myself in terms of all I left behind and how different from my upbringing that I am.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I'd like to jump from that to what you see as the key insights of the African-American intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois when it comes to understanding racism and the U.S. working class in his book, Black Reconstruction in America and Elsewhere. Now, some listeners will probably be familiar with his ideas, but others not. So can you sum up what you see as those key insights and how those insights might connect with what you learned back in the early 90s from those union members?
Thank you. Du Bois lived a very long time and wrote a lot of various different things. He lived to be 95, almost from the Civil War. His death was announced at the March on Washington in 1963. So it's a long time. And 30 years before his death, he writes this book, Black Reconstruction in America, which is the book that most influences me, and I think is still the best U.S. history book yet written. And I take three things from it. I think two of which are extraordinarily well known, and one of which is not very emphasized and I think is lost. So the first one is Du Bois argues in Black Reconstruction that the Civil War was won via a general strike of the slaves, what he calls a general strike of the slaves. That is, that of the 4 million slaves, perhaps a quarter directly fled to freedom, got their own freedom. Tens of thousands ended up in the Union Army, and that it was this persistent movement toward freedom of masses of enslaved people that convinced Lincoln to make the war, which had been just about Union and constitutional issues in the way that it was talked about by politicians, to make it into an emancipationist war. So the insight is that we don't always look at change as coming from the top, as coming from the presidents, as coming from the generals, but as coming from what the tradition that I belong to likes to call the self-activity of working people, the ways that working people forward their own demands and create their own structures and use their own knowledge to get free. So the first one would be the general strike of the slaves. The second, and famously again, is that Du Bois coined this phrase, public and psychological wage, to describe what whites got out of being white in the South in the wake of the Civil War. And he said that it wasn't always, and in fact, it was frequently not material prosperity, that sometimes the poorest whites clung the hardest to this public and psychological wage that was granted by white civil society, but also by the state. And that implied that the best parks, the best schools, the best art museums, the best bathrooms, the best everything would be available to white workers and not to black workers. And this public and psychological wage becomes, for me, the wage is whiteness in the book title that you mentioned in the introduction. It doesn't deny that white workers derived direct material benefits, that their wages were higher, that they could get into the skilled trades, that all of those things are true. But it kind of implies that there are also this whole other range of things that don't necessarily get reflected in the pay envelope that secure the loyalty of white workers to whiteness, that make it seem like, and if you're very poor, make it seem like that's your only claim to property, is to have this expectation that someday whiteness will pay off. Now, the third thing that I take from Black Reconstruction is ignored, I think, in the way that we read it mostly, and that is that Du Bois insists that heroism, the sacrifice, the disability, the veteran status of enslaved people coming out of the general strike of the slaves actually did transform white workers for a time. And he says that for a decade, and he says, impossible as it is to believe, knowing the end of things, that for a decade, white workers really were transformed. And so if we want to imagine this, I think what we'd imagine is that when the enslaved people come to the Union camp and say, I think this war, even though Lincoln says it's not, I think this war is about freedom. I think it's about my freedom. I want to join. I want to do work for the Union side. It's usually written about as if then a general has to decide what to do with them. But actually, in the first instance, it's the rank and file white soldier that meets them at the perimeter of the camp, that maybe finds them in the woods, that has to decide what the human response is going to be in this situation. So if you make that times 100,000, times 500,000, it's a very transformative experience for white workers. And it's important that Du Bois insists on that, because it sort of sets up the idea that we don't have to be hopeless about the possibility of change in the consciousness of white workers.
Thanks. And maybe continuing with the idea of self-activity being so important and the theme of people that you've learned from, can you talk about C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian-born Marxist theorist and historian whom you met at one point?
Yeah, I learned a lot from C.L.R. about a whole host of different things. He was another person who lived a very long time and had a lot of different interests. So his classic book, Black Jacobins, about the Haitian Revolution was my entry to how we would study revolution. I studied his sports writing. He was a sports writer, made his living as a sports writer in the 1930s when he went from Trinidad to Britain. He was a cricket correspondent. I didn't know anything about cricket. I learned about cricket in order to learn about C.L.R. James. He wrote plays. He wrote important things on the class nature of the Soviet Union that influenced me. And I'm kind of obsessed with Herman Melville as a U.S. writer and teach classes on Melville. And C.L.R. wrote a great book called Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways about Melville. And also it kind of gave these wonderful lectures that somebody gave me on tape in Trinidad about Melville that are kind of a model of how you would lecture about an important writer to people who hadn't read the writer. So it becomes, so I think about this a lot in writing, is how are we also storytellers at the same time that we're analysts or theoretical writers. So I mostly knew about James from people telling me you have to read James until shortly before his death, 80s, I guess, mid, I got a chance to go visit him in Brixton in London in his flat. And I was trying to get Northwestern to buy some of his papers, thinking that he needed money. He was actually, when I got there, it turned out he was very, very well cared for by comrades. But I spent the morning doing the papers, and I tell this story because I think it gives real insight to what I really learned from CLR. I did an inventory of the papers, and then in the afternoon, he promised we could talk. And it turned out a cricket match was on, and he wouldn't part from the cricket match. So I sat around for that. And then I thought, oh, good, the cricket is finally over. And then he said, oh, but I have to watch my soap operas. Will you watch the soap operas? And it was because his caregivers, young West Indian women, watched the soap operas, and he wanted to be able to have an analysis of those, to be able to have something intelligent to talk about with these women. So my agenda for the day was that when I finally got his attention, and I did ultimately get his attention, I wanted to ask him about a series of strikes and demonstrations in southeast Missouri, not far from where I grew up, that I knew about, that were run by a group that was near and dear to me, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. And James came there visiting the United States as what we would now call an overstayer to the boot heel of Missouri, and organized those sharecroppers on behalf of the main Trotskyist party in the United States. And he called those workers, who were intensely religious and weren't even workers, they were sharecroppers. He called them the most advanced sector of the U.S. proletariat. And so I wanted to explore that, and partly just as personal history, local history. And I got him to listen to what I wanted. And then he circled his hand. He always circled his hand when he was making a point. He circled his hand and he said, yes, Missouri, where I first understood Hegel. And so the lesson for me was, you don't have to be interested in just books. You don't have to be interested in, you don't have to draw a line between high theory and everyday life. He thought I needed a lesson in Hegel, and he wasn't going to be diverted to tell me the details of these strikes in the boot heel. And he said, I read the phenomenology for the umpteenth time on the porch of these sharecroppers, and it was by virtue of being surrounded by so much social motion and seeing people making leaps that Hegel and Lenin talked about dialectically. It was then, he said, that I could finally understand Hegel. So it's this, for me, the lesson, which is much more profound than if you just talked about the nuts and bolts of trade union history or radical party history in that period, was exactly that you can move between big ideas and everyday life. You have to make that move.
And this brings us to someone who I think few listeners will have heard about, George Roediger. So can you tell us who he was and what you learned from him?
George Roediger was my point of entree to James. I mean, the reason that I knew where James was and got to go and got a chunk of his time was that I had come to know George Roediger in St. Louis. He was Jewish, Brooklyn-born historian and sociologist who happened to live very close to my uncle in the Central West End, the trendiest neighborhood in St. Louis. And I learned about him because he was the editor of the American Slave Collection, the big Library of Congress collection of interviews with formerly enslaved people that was done in the 1930s as a New Deal project. And these papers just kind of languished. And at the time, historians of slavery didn't really use slave sources at all. They pretended to believe that slave sources were, quote unquote, too biased to use. And so the way that George told this story was he'd gotten out of high school and just after the war, World War II, and he joined the Communist Party and was a communist for some years, and then kind of joined every left group, particularly on the Trotskyist left, and kind of kept me out of those groups. He said, I've joined them all. You don't have to. And so he ran through all of these, but mainly was a follower of Max Shachtman and was in that milieu when the civil rights movement erupted, and he realized that he had nothing to say to what was the most exciting struggle in his life. And he then found CLR James and became a stalwart member of James's group Facing Reality in that period. And he, through James asked him one day, what can we know about slaves from the slave's point of view? And Roediger said, well, there are these, the interviews together look like a giant encyclopedia on a shelf. There are these bound volumes of typescript interviews with thousands of ex-slaves. Now they're, it's 60 years after slavery, so they're very old, and the sources have a particular set of challenges, but they are the formerly enslaved speaking their own truths. And so he gives a talk in that same flat in Brixton that James was in, and about what would it look like to study the slaves through these sources. And then he writes a book called From Sundown to Sunup that's about that, and publishes the whole encyclopedia in, I think, 21 volumes of testimony of ex-slaves. So it's the same idea that we start from below. We start from what the people who are actually oppressed within a system believe and imagine, and then go from there. He also wrote a wonderful article on the founding of the CIO and the burst of militant trade union activity in the 1930s, in which he insists that the unions didn't organize the workers organized the unions. And it's that same switching of the kind of standard narrative of who were the leaders, what were the conferences, what were the position papers, and to begin to say, well, what is it that predisposed workers in that particular moment to be able to take all these risks and to organize before there was a CIO?
Earlier you mentioned the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, and in An Ordinary White, you write about learning from a couple of veterans of that organization. Can you tell us what that Farmers Union was and what you learned from those folks?
Yeah, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union was a signally important example of Black-white trade union unity in the 1930s and the 1940s. And it organized ultimately in a lot of different places, but its base was 100 miles from where I grew up in Southeast Missouri and then in Arkansas. And it organized farm laborers, certainly, but it ended up mostly trying to address the problems of sharecroppers who were getting kicked off their land. And they were getting kicked off their land in the 1930s because the New Deal was offering subsidies not to produce to people who owned vast amount of land. And so these cotton plantations that had been carved up into sharecropping plots, now the owner could make more money by passively collecting coupons on government subsidies. And it was the STFU led demonstrations blocking highways in the late 1930s in Southeast Missouri and Northwest Arkansas in order to press a demand that if they were going to be kicked off the land, they needed to at least have housing and they needed to have some kind of meaningful work. The union lasts and becomes kind of a precursor of the National Farm Labor Union and then the United Farm Workers, the famous agricultural labor union. So it's an important example of Black-white unity. I think most of the time it was about half white and half Black, and of agricultural unionism at a time when union leaders were saying, it's impossible to organize agricultural workers. And the state was saying agricultural workers don't come under the there are not enough workers to come under the protection of labor law. So the two people that I knew from it were its co-founder, longtime leader, H.L. Mitchell, who wrote a great book about his life called Mean Things Happening in This Land, who was white, from Arkansas, and a very charismatic folk singer named John Hancock, who Mike Honey has recently done a book about. And Hancock's wrote Roll the Union On, a very famous picket line anthem. He wrote a great song called Raggedy Raggedy. He sang songs like Oh Freedom and Solidarity Forever as if they were his songs, and changed all the lyrics to make them his songs. I think he might have thought that he had a hand in writing Solidarity Forever because it so became his anthem. And what I think I learned from the two of them is just what it is to be committed to a lifetime of radicalism. They were both quite old. They both died not a decade after I came to be friends with them. I was teaching at University of Missouri. Mitchell kind of made a circuit of college campuses trying to make people remember the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. So every year or two, I would see him there. And then we brought through him Hancock, who kind of disappeared from the labor movement. Was run out ahead of a lynch mob of Southeast Missouri, and went to Southern California and was active, but as such an anonymous rank and filer that nobody knew that he was this important cultural figure on the left. But the two of them, their love for each other was very important to think about, but also just this idea that, they were in their 80s and maybe 90s, and they were still holding fast to this lifelong of struggle ideal. I think we think about that too little. I think we think too much about how we can get people to do one more thing in the moment on the left, and we don't think enough about how we can imagine decade after decade of persistent struggle.
And that brings me to the last particular individual I want to ask you about, a veteran from an earlier era in the history of the exploited, the person you knew, Fred Thompson, who had been in the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies. So can you tell us a little bit about Fred and what you learned from him? And then maybe more broadly, any thoughts you might have about the significance of the IWW in the early 20th century for workers organizing today in the 21st century?
Yeah, Fred was a Canadian. He was born in the Maritimes in 1900. And he had this kind of theory that people who were born in 1900, that a lot of them were deep thinkers and radicals, because they were taking a responsibility for the century that they inaugurated with their birth. He spent most of his life in the United States. I did a little book that kind of half his reminiscences and half his writings. He was very, very self-effacing in certain ways. He didn't want the book about himself, and he thought what little individual life could matter at all. And I probably couldn't have done the book without police spying on him. He was a very persistently spy. He joined one big union in Canada, and then was in the IWW, and in the leadership of the IWW, edited the Industrial Worker, wrote the main in-house history of the IWW with Mike Hargis. He taught at Work People's College, the IWW Finnish college. He only had a high school education, but he was Professor Thompson at Work People's College. And so he was spied on very persistently, and we were able to kind of piece together all the dates of his life that he had forgotten, because the police spying and the immigration police spying was constantly under threat of deportation, like Harry Bridges. We forget that this deportation has always been a big club in the arsenal of capital against workers. So Fred was in San Quentin in the 1920s, and the story I'll tell about him in a minute was San Quentin based. But he, for criminal syndicalism, for soapboxing, basically, for giving pro IWW talks. And then I met him 50 years later. He was in Chicago. He was a kind of a legend on the left. The IWW headquarters was still in Chicago. I was around the IWW, not in it. I actually joined for 3 years when he died to kind of replace him for a moment at an interesting time in the IWW. But Fred had been given in his old age a task by other even older radicals, and they were the radicals from the Proletarian Party in the United States who came to own the Charles H. Kerr Socialist Publishing Company. And Kerr had published the first U.S. edition of Capital, the kind of standard edition of Capital, that all 3 volumes that radicals quoted, and a host of other books. And then was repressed successfully during World War I in the 20s, but continued not under the leadership of Charles H. Kerr, the person anymore, but under the Proletarian Party. The Proletarian Party itself was literally dying out. Its members were old and one by one dying. And so they asked Fred, who was himself 80, I think, at this time, to take over the company as a young person. And he said to me, he knew me from various things, and he said, maybe we can, together with the Chicago Surrealist Group and some others, maybe we can give this Kerr Company a decent burial. And that's what we set out to do. But it was sad, because we would have been sad to do that because it was such a historic, world's oldest English language socialist publisher, that we got tempted, we'll put out another book, and we'll put out another book. And then it was an anniversary of Haymarket, and we put out this big Haymarket scrapbook, and we attracted all sorts of revolutionaries from all over the world, but in Chicago, who ended up on the Kerr board in that period. But the story I'll tell about Fred and what I learned from him really fundamentally was how to argue with other comrades. I think he was really, really great at that in his old age. Anyway, he was very of that generation. He could quote poetry by the ream from memory. He'd burst into song once in a while during meetings. But he was very gentle with younger, and I wasn't very young. I was in my 30s at that time, but I was the youngest person in the group. He could be very gentle in also trying to teach people things. So whenever I had an idea for a book, and really whenever Franklin Rosemont, who was also involved in this, had an idea for a book, Fred would say, that would be of interest to you and me and half a dozen other people in the whole world. and he was claiming, a kind of a solidarity with that. It was interesting, but that it was impractical. The way this came to a head most vividly was Franklin and I and others on the Kerr board, wanted to publish some pamphlets, historic pamphlets on sabotage. And it was a time, very, very dark days of the U.S. labor movement. We thought it would be a contribution to publish these pamphlets on sabotage. And the IWW was beginning to be in alliance with Earth First. So there was this kind of talk about sabotage, but we wanted to publish these 3 pamphlets as a book on industrial sabotage. And Fred had the best answer ever for saying why he disagreed. And he said, oh, yes, sabotage. I spent 3 years in San Quentin based on loose talk about sabotage. And again, it wasn't that he was disagreeing. It was that he was cautioning. And he came around. We ended up publishing those. He could hear, but he was a really great, gentle teacher of things.
And then more broadly, do you have any thoughts about, for people who may not know anything about the history of the industrial workers of the world, which survives as a small organization, very different from what it once was, but to think back to what it was and what you might learn from the experience of the IWW in its heyday for people trying to reinvent the working class movement in the 21st century?
Well, I think parts of that would be the enthusiastic embrace of immigrant workers, the alliance with the Magon movement in the Mexican Revolution, but also the commitment to revolutionary industrial unionism that involved organizing everybody and not being divided by lines of skill or race or gender or those things within the imperfect, but within the U.S. Labor movement, exemplary, that would be a part of the IWW's heritage. The ability to envision organizing workers who were going to move a great deal and move from job to job a great deal. I think we still imagine reaching the person who's going to be 30 years in an auto plant. And that's a segment of the working class that has some social power and history that's important, but it's not the kind of typical working class experience. Now, in a way, that experience is an experience of itinerancy. And so the IWW's methods for not stressing the contract and the year-to-year struggle, but and liking to have short-term contracts so you could be back fighting another time. The kind of willingness to move through places and see what you can do without necessarily polling to see if you can win every. The boldness of the IWW in its heyday, I think, was an important thing that we can learn from it.
Great. So I'd like to now go back and pick up on the thread when you were talking earlier about the insights of white workers about white advantages, and what you see as being at stake for anti-racist politics in, the point that you make in in your memoir about how critical insights into white advantage grow, in your words, organically within some parts of everyday white lives.
Yeah, and this goes back to why I started the book with that anecdote about St. Louis in the early 1990s, because I think that I had some extraordinarily lucky things happen to me to become a revolutionary and a socialist in my life. And mostly those had to do with being really accidentally as a teenager around an epic Black struggle in Cairo, Illinois. And that, I realized that was a big difference maker in my life. But in general, the things that I was calling upon to be able to even to respond to that good luck were things that didn't happen to me. They happened to millions of people in that time. And so I think that one of them would have been being in a family and an extended family that was immersed in trade unionism. And at that time, there were still lots of strikes and used to talking about the world in terms of bosses and workers and being class conscious and knowing how to behave during a strike. That was my family, but it was most families in St. Louis was a union town, and it was nationally tens of millions of people were in such unions, and more were growing up in households influenced by those unions. A big majority of the working class was against the war on Vietnam, and so my openness to kind of anti-racist and socialist ideas was very much conditioned by a particular small town experience of coming to oppose the war after supporting it until I was pretty far into high school. But a very charismatic high jumper, the best athlete in our school, graduated and went to Canada. And another former schoolmate of mine got killed in Vietnam. And all of a sudden, those debates became very concrete. And, so that I was a post-Vatican II Catholic household that I came from. And so all of a sudden, the Berrigans were on our radar, and the Dorothy Day was on our radar, and folk music came to me first through these attempts to liberalize the Catholic Church. That's 80 million people experienced that post-Vatican II Catholicism. It wasn't a lasting thing for me, but it was an important thing for me. And immersion in Black culture, both for the Black working class and for the rest of the working class. A very complicated thing. We lived in a town where Black people couldn't be around after sundown, but it was 10 miles from East St. Louis and 12 from St. Louis. So these kind of meccas of African American culture, of blues and jazz and African American dance. And athleticism in terms of the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team. We all were in that world. And, many people transmogrified those experiences into a return to racism or a hardening of racism, even if they liked soul music. But it was a part of all of our lives. And to be able to just bracket that as incorrigible or deplorable is, I think, counterproductive. And it's counterproductive also in the sense that the people who are doing it do it through an electoral calculus. They do it through a commitment to the Democratic Party. And that's exactly the last place that this flexibility and multiplicity of white attitudes is going to show up. In electoral politics in the two-party United States, at least since Clinton, both parties have appealed to white workers based on their worst instinct. They've said, we won't do much about racial justice. We're going to cut this. We're going to cut that. We're going to end welfare as we know. We're going to throw 2 million people in jail. And that's why, as white workers, or as Clinton would put it, as the white middle class, you ought to support us. So it's not these kinds of flexibilities, these kinds of impulses toward thinking differently from Trumpism, I think are always there. But they're not going to show up in Democratic Party politics, at least initially.
And so then this brings up the question about the relationship between, on the one hand, movements and struggles of people who experience racial oppression and their own self-activity, and then on the other hand, the way that some white people will develop insights about racism and white advantage. So can you say something about how you see the relationship between those things in history and how that plays out? Because I think we need to understand both poles of that dynamic.
Yeah, George Roediger used to say that if you wanted to predict white working class motion in the United States, it would be to look for historically important Black social movements alongside or predating that motion. So in my life, it's this connection with Cairo and the Black United Front in Cairo and the Black Catholic Church in Cairo and these kinds of struggles of Black workers in Cairo that made me kind of see that the world wasn't all about either a sundown town where I grew up, a whites only town, or in the integrated city of Cairo, armed camps between Black and white. There was this other set of possibilities, and I could see it, and I could act on that, and I could have a much more meaningful, say, opposition to the war in Vietnam. A good historical example is the self-emancipation of enslaved people that we talked about before. We didn't have in the United States a national labor movement until enslaved people freed themselves. They didn't free themselves and join unions by and large, but they freed themselves and inspired unions. So they called Emancipation Jubilee, and they talked about it in biblical terms and in this kind of cosmic history that all of a sudden life is going to be remade. And some white workers then witnessing that, witnessing the heroism of the general strike of the slaves, but also the achievement of the general strike of the slaves, that all of a sudden everything that was impossible in U.S. Politics, immediate emancipation, uncompensated emancipation, unplanned emancipation, all of that came true. So white workers begin to say, what would our Jubilee look like? And our Jubilee, it was most often articulated as the 8-hour working day. And the slogan was 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. And that what we will is this kind of idea, the word emancipation and self-emancipation that becomes so central to a certain strain of Marxism, that word becomes available because of the self-emancipation of U.S. slaves and finds its way then into the Marxist tradition. I think in my late teens, something like that was going on as well. That there was that the Black Freedom Movement had done things that seemed impossible. That decolonization in Africa had done things. CLR once, he said, if you would have told me that the pace of decolonization was going to proceed in this way, I would have said you were an agent provocateur. And it was just startling that this kind of overturning of these oppressive structures had happened. And what else did you get? Well, you got women's liberation, the second women's liberation movement. The first one had developed inspired by the emancipation of slaves. You got the second women's liberation movement. You got this wave of wildcat strikes and other kinds of self-activity in the plants, and you got gay liberation that are all, extraordinarily beholden to the Black freedom movement's heroism and example.
It's interesting to think about, even on a much smaller scale and in a very different way, how the movement for Black lives in the 21st century, could kind of be seen as a catalytic force as well.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the Starbucks strikes and organizing in the United States, which has a lot of barriers to overcome at law and in the way that you can organize. But I think it's absolutely true that, again, it's based on everyday lives. It's based on the fact that people had these experiences out in the streets, particularly after the George Floyd one and at the time of COVID. And they were also having these experiences at work where COVID revealed that they had a lot of social power. I was in DC part of this time, and I'd go to this little place, and half the time there'd be a sign on the door that said, too crowded, no one else can come in to customers. And, there was no manager there. I talked to workers afterwards. There was no manager there that made that decision. People just felt empowered to make that decision. So you get that kind of combination, and then you get a workforce that I just learned in Chicago at a talk this weekend is 70% queer identified. And you've got this, it's an extraordinarily interesting struggle that even the bargaining, particularly for queer rights, is just completely different from other unions. And I think, it's exactly a good example of that.
Now, in your memoir, you observe that scholars engaged in the critical study of whiteness have failed in what you call the fight with racial liberalism by failing to make quote unquote white privilege a weapon in contesting the class and racial struggles of racial capitalism. So how do you see the problem of racial liberalism, and how has it defanged the idea of white privilege, so that I think you now prefer the term white advantage rather than white privilege, which I think is a good shift to make?
Yeah, let me just begin at the back of that with the white advantage, white privilege one. White privilege is a term coined by the left. Ted Allen and Noel Ignatieff, as far as we know, were the first to really theorize it. And I've never been able to figure out, even knowing Noel and Ted a little bit, why they picked privilege to talk about it as a certain kind of traditional use on the left of privilege, but not exactly that you would use it in this instance. But I've been very loyal to it through the years because a lot of good work has been done under it, particularly good academic work has been done under it. I think, though, that it turns out that it's not really an organizing strategy. I just read an article that I think the title was "White Privilege is Not an Organizing Strategy." To tell people that they're privileged, who often don't, and rightly don't, imagine themselves as privileged, is tricky business for organizing, and it might get you not heard more than it gets you heard. So I kind of have gently been saying white advantage, not insisting on it, not dismissing the insight. But white privilege, I think, kind of became a term for DEI trainers and for a different kind of. It was originally a left term, and just as those training sessions that I'm talking about in the 90s, tons of rank and file leftists were doing that kind of work unpaid. But it became something that was much more corporate, much more military, much more enforced. Workers have to go to these trainings, and so it was hard to think how this actually gains us a hearing. And a few people, Paul Gilroy, I was very gratified that he wrote me and said that he had kind of adopted white advantage as a way to talk about these things. But on the failures of racial liberalism, there are many, I think. One is gradualism. I mean, Dr. King's indictments of gradualism, I think, really have applied all the way since that, but also allied with a kind of a sense of U.S. nationalism, U.S. chauvinism, and U.S. exceptionalism, the idea that in the long run, this is such a great country that it's bound to solve these issues, and that might work until there's counter-revolution. And now we're seeing, and we really have been seeing it all along. I mean, affirmative action, which was not what we wanted, was just for a minute, and then was gutted under Clinton, but he would have said mended under Clinton, but could do very little. And so you got these fundings of DEI programs inside of corporations and inside of universities that promised a lot, but had no mechanism to deliver anything. And the ground rule was always that you couldn't criticize capitalism and you couldn't criticize the Democratic Party within these. And so racial liberalism was wedded to this vision that I think was not just, that actually kind of actively prevented coalition partners from raising bold demands on the behalf of their constituencies. The whole Clinton scam was to say to labor, we'll listen to you, they meant white labor, we'll listen to you insofar as you're saying that we shouldn't do much for black folks. And then to black folks, well, you can't ask for much or you'll lose to the really, really far right. And meanwhile, you get NAFTA and you get neoliberalism and you get everything else that's impacting the union. So I think that within those ground rules, instead of trying to imagine a political movement that could win the labor movement because it was doing so much on behalf of the labor movement, and a political movement that could win black people and immigrants because it was doing so much on their behalf, you get these brokers who say, we'll explain to our constituencies why we can't do much and never could do much. And because United Statesians so believe that politics is electoral politics now, it's hard to break through that. So if you want to talk to people about politics, you end up being confined by those ground rules, which are the ground rules of racial liberalism, but are also the ground rules of the Democratic Party and of the union bureaucracies.
A very tight confinement.
Yes.
Yeah. And in response to some of these problems, there is a current of leftists that don't just reject liberal anti-racism, but now reject anti-racism per se, claiming that politics, when they're specifically anti-racist, are supposedly a dead end. There's a new book with a clickbaity title by Jennifer Pan called Selling Social Justice, Why the Rich Love Anti-Racism, that comes to mind. But I don't think Pan's in any way original. What she's doing is just really promoting ideas that have been developed already by people like Adolph Reed Jr., Walter Ben Michaels, and Cedric Johnson. And readers, whether they realize it or not, of many articles, for example, in Jacobin, will have come across these politics because this tends to be the way that Jacobin approaches these issues. So these politics aren't new, though. And I'm just going to quote the U.S. socialist Kim Moody. He wrote an article which listeners will be able to find linked in the show notes. Moody called these politics that downplayed the significance of race as a dividing line in working class life and American society in general, without denying the reality of racism. In the aftermath of the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, substituted the trade union bureaucracy for the working class in the practice of, quote, building alliances, unquote, in its version of so-called coalition politics. It was associated above all with A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, two of the best-known African Americans in this country's civil rights, labor, and socialist movements. So this politics that we're talking about presents itself as class politics. What's your take on this kind of class politics?
Yeah, I think I spoke to some of it in the racial liberalism answer, but the first thing I'd say about it is that I think that I've learned some things from Adolf, and particularly from others who write on his the non-site website. In the distant past, I learned a lot from Adolf Reed, and I think there are some serious people still in that terrain, and Cedric Johnson in particular, and then also some unserious people like Ben Michaels and Norman Finkelstein, tragically recent book. And we've all from Mayfield and Bayard Rustin, and it's this their connection. This particular debate is about the ends of their lives, and they're kind of a sad end to both of their political lives. So I think that part of it, the explanation for this, what opponents call class reductionist politics, is, as Moody says, an orientation toward the labor bureaucracy. Sadly, some of it came via Labor Party advocates and an actual attempt to build a Labor Party, but from the top, mostly, rather than from the bottom. But an orientation to the labor bureaucracy, as Moody says, but also an orientation toward the Democratic Party, and to have a comfortable relationship with the Democratic Party. And there's an irony there, because the segment of the Democratic Party that most pushes this is actually the far right of the Democratic Party, the Clinton wing, the New Democrats, who, when they say it's the economy stupid, it's close enough to it's all about class and not race, that that's the glue that connects this set of analyses to electoral politics in the United States. It's not connected to AOC even, for example. But I do want to say one more serious thing about this, and that is that I'm not quite comfortable with class reductionism as the rubric in which we discuss this, because I think what's really noteworthy about the Reed position is how flimsy it is with regard to class. And this is, when some of us insist that you don't get to class without understanding race in the United States, this seems to me a really good example of it, because at least as it proliferates, I mean, if you just read people's Facebook pages, for example, the understanding is that the professional managerial class runs the United States. And you have almost no talk about ruling classes and class fractions and trying to figure out this very complicated situation about who exactly tolerates, within the world of capital, tolerates Trump, and for what reasons. And instead you get this analysis that posits that this completely under-theorized group, the professional managerial class, is our problem. And kind of at a moment when we really need to think in a way that includes as many people in the working class as possible, and certainly includes professionals like nurses and teachers, who in the last 15 years have been the leading edge of working class militancy in the United States, to then come up with this kind of mishmash class, some of who stand in all different relations to the means of production, and to say that's what we want to focus on, is this professional managerial class. I learned from Barbara. I wrote a book on the middle class that kind of failed, and I'm sad about, in 2020, and then it was republished in 2022. And I learned a lot from Barbara Ehrenreich, and I'm not against trying to disentangle, to take professional managerial class and disentangle its various components. But that's not what's happening here. It's just being used as a club to say these are people who, and the implication is that they're intellectuals, and that workers aren't intellectuals, and that they're bound to be alienated and manipulative toward the working class movement. And so I think that to even call the position a class reductionist position is to grant too much. I don't think it's very much successful in talking about class at all.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it just strikes me as bizarre at a time when more and more working class people are attending post-secondary education because of they're trying to get an advantage in a deteriorating job market, and going deeper and deeper into debt to do it, and living more difficult lives as a result, to then come up with this, I think, absurd way of thinking about class, where people use credentials as a proxy, and it's
so college, no college, becomes the class marker in the
New York Times and in some other places too.
Right, yeah.
So just to wrap up, let's talk a little bit about what you see as a much more promising way of approaching the fight against the interlocked relations of racial oppression and class exploitation. And I'm reminded here of an article that you co-wrote back in 2006 with Betsy Esch in the magazine New Socialist, of which I was one of the editors at the time. The article was called "Non-Racialism Through Race, bracket, and Class, bracket." What did you mean when you used that term? And can you just offer listeners what you see as a better approach to taking on racism and class exploitation together?
I'm glad that you mentioned that article, because it's something that led Betsy Esch and I to collaborate on the book "The Production of Difference," which came out about a decade later, and which was really an enjoyable project. And I was thinking in that article, most of the ideas in that article are Betsy's and not mine. But what was animating me was thinking way back to the early 1990s when I was in South Africa. At the very tail end of the academic boycott of South Africa, the ANC and COSATU began inviting some people to come to South Africa and to do particular things, not to travel, not to treat it as normal, but to do some particular things. And so I was there, and I picked up right away in Cape Town that the colored population, the mixed race category in apartheid, whenever anybody from the left stood up and spoke as a colored person, they would say so-called colored. And so I began to say so-called white. And I wanted that term because it flagged for me the social construction of race, the craziness of race. And I used it for a while. And then some old timers, and these were old timers trained by Neville Alexander, and there's this new debate about where racial capitalism comes from that emphasizes the use of racial capitalism in South Africa before it was used in Britain and in the United States. So these were people who were Neville's proteges in some way or another. And they kind of took me aside and said, hey, that's unuseful to say so-called white. We believe in non-racialism, but we believe, as they put it, that the road to non-racialism is through race. And so to say so-called colored at a certain political point, but to say so-called white, risk people saying, oh yeah, just that's not much of anything. That distinction's not one that we really have to attend to. So this is what I was thinking when I said that. And of course, the ANC at that time was committed to both non-racialism and COSATU and to socialism, at least as a broad project. So I think that they wouldn't have felt the need to say, and Neville Alexander wouldn't have felt the need to say, and class, and parenthetically, and class, that was just assumed, but maybe it was too much assumed. And so, if I were to put it now, I would say the road to non-racialism is through race and anti-capital. I think that we begin to see that if we don't tackle those two things together, we can't do either one of them very well.
David, thanks so much for your time and talking about all these questions.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
And I'll just mention to listeners that my book, Red Flags, A Reckoning with Communism for the Future of the Left, is available from Fernwood Publishing with a discount to listeners of Victor's Children. If you use the discount code RF15, you can get 15% off. Thanks for listening. That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.